Hello. Since this Sunday is Mother's Day, in our quarantine and confident devotions this week, it's Mom's Week. We're going to talk about a few great moms in the Bible whom God used to bless their families and bless other people through their faithful words and actions. The mom we're looking at today is maybe someone whose name you don't recognize. The woman's name is Jochebed, and she is the mother of Moses. Jochebed was extremely brave and faithful. We'll talk about her love and faith and how that showed itself in how she took care of Moses. First activity there in the introduction: draw or describe a time when you saw your mother doing something to protect you. The very first thing that I thought of, and maybe you are familiar with this, but I remember seeing this cartoon when I was very little, Mom, the original seatbelt, and thinking, I get that one. I'm young. I'm a young boy, but I get that joke. That's funny. If you don't know what this is all about, if you're driving in the car with your mom, and all of a sudden, the car in front of you brakes real hard, and your mom has to slam on her brakes, and just the arm shoots out and it keeps you pinned up against the seat so you don't, move forward or get whiplash or hurt your face, whatever else it is. My mom was the queen of that. Her instincts were so good, just wham, not to hurt me, but to keep me in place, and it was really good. I can think of countless times that happened, and that's like my instinct now too. When I'm driving in the car with my wife, brakes go on, arm goes out, seatbelt. So there's lots of other examples of my mom doing things to protect me, but this is the very first one that I thought of. So, talking about Jochebed protecting her son Moses, we should talk about the background a little bit. So, this is a couple hundred years after the story of Joseph and his father Jacob and Joseph's brothers, if you remember all of that. Joseph, by God's grace, was pretty much in charge of all of Egypt, but he was dead and gone in heaven. And the new administration of Egypt didn't care less or couldn't care less about Joseph and the Israelites, and just kind of thought, "Oh, these Israelites are not very fun to have around. We don't really want them here." So they keep growing as a people, and what if they get so big that they decide to conquer us Egyptians? So the administration ordered the people watching over the Israelites to be very harsh to them, to enslave them, to make their lives miserable. And they thought, well, maybe that will keep the population down, but it didn't. God bless Israelites, and the population kept getting bigger and bigger. Well, then the administration said, well, let's do something more drastic, and this is pretty intense. They told the midwives who were in charge of helping the Israelite women give birth, they said, well, if the baby's a girl, then you can allow her to live, but if the baby's a boy, you need to kill that baby. And they thought, for sure, this will slow down the Israelite population. But the midwives who were in charge of this childbirth, helping with it, they feared God in a very healthy way. They loved God, and so they decided not to do this. And they told the administration, well, we can't. These Israelite women give birth so fast that we can't even get there to end the baby's life. And and by this way, by the faith of these brave women, God allowed the Israelite population to grow. So the administration said again to these midwives and basically made it clear to Israel, you cannot have baby boys. If there's a baby girl, that's fine, but all baby boys are to be thrown into the Nile River. Well, so Moses' mother gives birth to a son and hides him for 3 months, which is pretty intense. We'll talk about that in just a second. But she hides him for 3 months. You imagine just the tension there of trying to keep a newborn baby quiet enough to keep him hidden for 3 months in close quarters with your neighbors and things like that. And eventually, Moses gets too big that she realizes, I can't hide him anymore. And so what she does is she makes this little waterproof basket for him, and coats it with pitch so the water can't get in, and she puts him in the Nile River. And then she stations Moses' sister Miriam nearby to kind of see what happens. So baby Moses is floating in the river, and he's not named Moses yet. He will get that name Moses later. But Pharaoh's daughter, one of Pharaoh's daughters, comes down to the river and sees this baby in the basket and hears him crying and has mercy on him and says, I'm going to take this baby in as my own. And Moses' sister Miriam is watching close by, and she runs up to the princess and says, do you want me to find someone who will take care of this baby and will nurse this baby until maybe he's old enough to come live with you? And the daughter of Pharaoh says, yeah, that'd be great. And so Moses' sister Miriam goes and takes Moses back to Jochebed. And in that way, Moses is allowed to grow up into his parents' house for a little while longer before he ends up going to live in the palace of the Pharaoh. So some extreme bravery from Jochebed here, defying a government order that she knew was wrong, and also risking her life in order to keep Moses alive and displaying some creativity and wisdom along the way. So let's talk through a few of these activities here on the sheet. Hebrews 11:23 says, "By faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." So Hebrews 11, if you know that chapter, it's sort of a hall of fame of faith, if you will. People to whom God gave tremendous faith, and they demonstrated that faith in some pretty awesome ways. So Moses' parents, including Jochebed, are included in that hall of fame of faith because they wonderfully defy the Pharaoh's order here. And they're not afraid of it, it says. So the first activity says, describe how your parents taught you to handle fears as a Christian. First thing that came to me, I think when you're little and you go to a funeral, you lose a grandparent, you start thinking about death, and that can be kind of scary. My grandfather died when I was relatively young. I think I was fifth grade, maybe sixth grade. So not super little, but old enough that I was starting to think about the concept of mortality and things like that. And when my grandfather died, who was an amazing pastor for a long time, my dad's dad, it was so matter of fact that my grandpa was in heaven, and it was okay to be sad because you love your grandpa and you miss him. But as you grieve, know that you don't need to be afraid of death because your grandpa's in heaven now. And one day you will join him there because Jesus died for us and he rose again from the dead. So because of what God did for us through Jesus, your grandpa's in heaven, and one day you'll see him there too. And I'm very grateful for that from a very early age, my mom and my dad really helped me to understand there's no reason to be afraid of death because death for a Christian becomes just the door to heaven. Number 2 says Jochebed ended up hiding baby Moses for 3 months in their home. If you were in her position, what kind of prayers do you think you would have offered to God during this time? As I mentioned earlier, I just can't imagine how intense that was to keep a newborn baby quiet. And every time the baby cried, just think they're going to hear. People are going to know there's a baby in here. They're going to come and get all of us. And, during that time, you imagine Jochebed must have had a very active prayer life. Maybe just a quick word about prayer. I really like this quote from Martin Luther. Prayer is not overcoming God's reluctance, but laying hold of his willingness. The point of that just being, prayer is not, we're not overcoming God. God's like, I don't know if I should do it. And then our prayer is like, you have to do it. No, God is willing to do whatever is best for us. And when we go to him in prayer, we're going to him as dear children go to their dear father, as the Bible says. So her prayers, I'm sure, were just, God, please protect our family. Please work all this for our good. And God certainly heard that prayer and was willing to answer it in the best possible way. Number 3 says, when it was impossible to hide Moses any longer, Jochebed used her God-given skills to creatively build him a watertight basket. Identified 2 to 3 God-given skills that Christian moms often use to bless their children. I was thinking about my mom. My mom was an extremely talented lady. God gave her a lot of gifts. I was thinking especially about the gifts she showed at work. My mom still works, but she spent a lot of years working at department stores called places like Boston Store, which is, I think around here is called Herberger's. She worked at Macy's for a long time, and I was always impressed by her work ethic. I think she just was extremely dedicated to her job. When she was there, she worked really hard, made it clear that her faith was the reason why she was working so hard, treated people nicely and fairly, and was recognized for that at her job. And by the way, I think all 3 of us kids, 3 growth kids, ended up working for her at some point. Summers are coming home from school on winter breaks, so we certainly benefited from that. We're doing some part-time seasonal work, so I've always been impressed with my mom's ability to work. I think that God gave her that gift, and she used that very well. Okay, 2 more. When Jochebed placed baby Moses into the Nile, she clearly trusted that God would protect him and care for him. List 2 to 3 ways you saw your mother demonstrate similar trust in God. For me, it's funny, I was actually thinking through this, and I received a visit from Mrs. Sue Taylor, our 1st and 2nd grade teacher, and I just said, I'm really trying to think of what I could put here, and she said, baptism. Your mom took you to the waters of baptism, and I said, Mrs. Taylor, that's a great idea. And so thank you, Mrs. Taylor, for giving me this idea. But it's true. I think I was 4 days old when my parents brought me to be baptized. And by doing that, they placed trust that God would wash me clean from my sins, would make me a part of his family, and had an inheritance waiting for me in heaven as God's son. So My baptism is really the greatest gift my parents have ever given me, along with my Christian education following that baptism. But to know that they brought me to the font and took me home knowing that I was God's child, washed clean and new, that's pretty big. I value that every day. Finally, explain how later on hearing this account of his parents' trust would be a help to Moses as an adult. So Moses grows up in the palace of Pharaoh, and not really, we don't really know how much he knew about his family and his upbringing those first few months of his life. But you can just imagine that, I mean, he writes the book of Exodus, so he knows this. He's, by divine inspiration, he's given access to this information. So you just imagine Moses later on hearing about how brave his parents were, and especially his mom. What that must have been like for him. Just, oh man, I'm so blessed. I had this awesome mom, and I didn't know her right away, but I'm glad that she had such trust in God. And I can't help but think about Moses later on and the trust that he shows in God and the boldness that he shows to stand up to Israel's enemies, and not because he's an awesome leader, but because he has such trust in this awesome God. What Jochebed shows here is trust that God is going to work things out no matter what. What Moses demonstrates throughout his time as Israel's leader is the same thing. Trust that God is going to work things out no matter what. Okay, that's our first mom for this week. Jochebed is a great example of a faithful mom, trusting that God would work all things for our good. I'm thankful for my mom. Maybe you can think about some things your wonderful moms out there have done for you too. Okay, God bless and take care.